Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm just going to wait a few more minutes or maybe one more minute, because we always have a rush of people into the Zoom room at the last minute. We've got about 100 people here tonight. We usually have about 140 or 150. We also have our Zoom and live stream going on YouTube. So I'll just give it another second before we get started officially. All right. Well, I am happy to be back. I'm Will Rosenzweig. I want to just thank Pooja and Eva for doing such a wonderful job last week in my absence, as I was recovering from being possessed by the second dose of a vaccine. But I'm happy to be back in full strength instead tonight, and thrilled about our class tonight. You know, these last several classes, the last four really, we've got three more to go, including tonight. The last four have really been focused on entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial journey. And last week was really a wonderful class. You know, we're full force into spring, and if you're outside, if you've had a chance to look around, especially in the Bay Area, you're seeing that everything is starting to bloom, and it's actually blooming early. By my records, things in my garden are about 2 weeks early. And I checked the National Centers for Environmental Information today, and it turns out that this March 2021, was, I think, the 8th warmest on record for the planet from 1880. So despite the beauty that we might experience on the surface, we're still, as Vice President Gore reminded us, experiencing a climate emergency. And so every day I try to reconcile, how do we live in this moment, and how do we take the actions and bring the intention that we really need to address the pressing problems in front of us. And as we've learned throughout the semester, that more and more we understand that climate justice is related to social and racial justice, and that many of the kind of low-hanging immediate actions that human beings, governments, companies, eaters can all participate in is really transforming the food system. So that's what our class is about here, edible education, learning how to become not only enlightened eaters, but meaningful change makers. And, you know, last week we talked about removing barriers to, removing barriers to successful entrepreneurship, and seeing the innovation that La Cocina represents in terms of making technical skills available, kitchen facilities and licensing and available below cost, and now their marketplace that they're opening. And it's such a terrific local model that spawned many other similar models. And I think when Caleb Zegas, the executive director, was talking to us, he really reminded us that we need to make choices about where we want to spend our money, and use up our meal occasions, and do it with an appreciation of not only sort of the immediate gratification that food brings us, or the energy that it brings us, but also the cultural value that it compels to a community or a city. And I also thought I wanted to mention that Caleb's final presentation, which I was so taken by, his humility, his sense of commitment, and his sense of really service. You know, he told us the story that he got, that he started at La Cocina at the bottom of the ladder, so to speak, and that he came from kind of a hospitality, service, and civil rights, social justice kind of background. And the kind of leadership that he exudes, you'd call servant leadership. He's really in service to a mission. And I think you're going to find tonight that our guests are also servant leaders of a kind, where they've defined a purpose, which is not only to meet a market need or an unmet need in a marketplace, in the food market, but also to better improve, lift the ecosystem, the stakeholders, the community, the providers, the farmers, the entrepreneurs in each of their business models. So I'm really excited to move into that tonight. So we have three really wonderful, spirited, mission-driven entrepreneurs who are not much older than many of you. They're just a few steps ahead of where you are. So I particularly like to bring young people to class. They're finding their way. They're having some successes and some challenges, but they're distinct. And it's going to be real exciting for you to meet them in just a few minutes. Before I introduce Sana, Jorge, and Larissa, though, I wanted to introduce you to two economists who had done sort of seminal work in the 1900s. They were both European-born economists, Joseph Schumpeter and E.F. Schumacher. Joseph Schumpeter was the first economist to really pay rigorous attention to the role of entrepreneurs in society and in business. And he did a lot of research after World War II and coined a term, creative destruction. And he said that entrepreneurs and this sort of wild spirit that they bring gives them the kind of perception and powers to reorder the system of supply. So he defined that entrepreneurs use this sort of art of creative destruction to reorder the system of supply. And before Schumpeter started to define this, people didn't really pay attention to entrepreneurs. They thought they were kind of, a unique species. And Schumpeter really brought it into cycles in the economy and in society. And Schumacher was also a very important economist who wrote, really one of my favorite books, which I have right here, called Small is Beautiful. And Schumacher invented what he called, he was very concerned with local systems and community-based business. And he thought a lot about scale, that he didn't think we should be measuring success based on economic output. He thought we should be measuring the success of an enterprise based on the happiness of the people involved. And he thought a lot about appropriate technologies that were appropriately scaled or sized or priced for local community work. And he also coined a term that he used around Buddhist economics. Buddhist economics really put livelihood, again, satisfaction, happiness, well-being at the heart of an enterprise, as opposed to pure profit motives, which we are kind of experiencing now in the realm of extreme capitalism we're experiencing. There's also a wonderful professor at Berkeley whose paths you might cross, named Claire Brown, who spoke at Edible Ed just a few years ago. And Professor Brown wrote a book called Buddhist Economics, where she lays out these principles that really value externalities like land, health and well-being of people. So I think I just wanted to mention Schumpeter from an entrepreneurial perspective, and Schumacher really from a small is beautiful model as great sort of academic proponents of these ideas. Because I think the models that you're going to experience tonight are examples of businesses that can have a very meaningful impact and they need to operate at a very thoughtful and intentional scale for every dynamic to create value. So with that, I want to stop sharing my screen. I want to introduce you now to our very first guest, somebody who really inspires me and has just been building a beautiful, delicious, meaningful global business from her desk and kitchen table in the East Bay. So please welcome Sana Javeri Kadri. Hi, Sana.
Hi, everybody. Hi there. Thank you for that intro, Will. It's great to be back at Edible Education. Hilariously enough, the last time I was here, I ended up hiring who is now my wholesale manager and my community care manager. So, like, go Edible Education as a great hiring tactic for me. My team was joking this morning about who I would come back with at the end of the night. But yeah, I'm the founder of Diaspora Co., which is a single origin spice company. What that means is we work with small organic, but more importantly, regenerative spice farmers all over South Asia. We usually pay them an average of 6x the commodity price, which is what we feel is like truly the fair price for them to exist in a sustainable way and continue to grow and invest in themselves. And in exchange for that, we bring American home cooks and consumers really the most delicious spices out there. Sometimes we're getting our customers' spices in as little as 2 months from when they were harvested on the farm. That's compared to in the grocery store where it's usually between 5 to 7 years old. So pretty like stale and tasteless. Um, I am 27, so I was sitting in your shoes exactly 4 years ago, which is very recent for me. And really, this company was born out of, I was a food studies major, so it was born out of 4 years of undergraduate education, tooling with, I think, a lot of the questions that y'all are sitting on right now and working through, though I think your access to amazing speakers is a little different than mine were. But so I grew up in Mumbai. I'm born and raised in Mumbai, India. And I grew up privileged with access to some of the best education in the world. I went to a fantastic private school in Mumbai. I then, got to attend a global boarding school on scholarship in Italy, and then an amazing liberal arts college in the US. And I think I spent a lot of time sitting with that privilege, this feeling of like, I have what most don't. And I think my family's approach to that privilege really informed exactly what Will was talking about, which is how to be of service and what is servant leadership. Because my dad's question was always, yes, you have all this privilege, but like, how are you going to use it to be of service and who are you going to serve? And I think that question has powered me through a lot of years, and I think will power me through several more. Um, and when we're talking about why did I start Diaspora and what did I want to see in the world, I have worked just about every food industry job. From I was the Van Leeuwen ice cream delivery driver, I was a farmer laborer, I was a baker at Avonlea. Like, I've done it all, but repeatedly I kept coming up against this feeling of I didn't see myself represented. I didn't see people that looked like me, or that had my life experience. Basically, I didn't see, queer, BIPOC immigrant folks in the food system. This was in 2016. And I wanted to carve out space for myself where I felt like I could be my full self. But I also wanted to work with where I came from. I had studied coffee and cacao for a lot of my undergraduate career, and I found that whilst it was fascinating, the specialty coffee movement or the bean to bar chocolate movement, I thought it a bit strange that like you're buying from these origins all over the world, but then the chocolate roasters or the coffee roasters like look nothing like the origin. And that discrepancy, nobody was talking about it. So I think when it came to finding what I would do, like most people, I was taught heavily by a Black woman who taught me at times I didn't deserve. So I had a professor called Phyllis Jackson, who was a Black Panther, a former Black Panther, and she was my art history professor. And she taught us through the lens of critical theory and Afrofuturism, where the premise of Afrofuturism is that you're imagining a world in the future that is really free of the systems of oppression that exist within reality. So, you know, what can exist in the future and then can be radically reimagined. And she was like, well, look at it through your lens. Your lens is you are a woman from Mumbai who's post-colonial. Your ancestors were freedom fighters who literally fought for, you know, the freedoms you enjoy today, and you want to work in food. Spices is like the perfect nexus of all of those things. My country was literally colonized for spices. And so this idea that I could start from scratch and completely reimagine what the spice trade could look like was honestly just like a really cool postgraduate art project of how do I build this? And like, if I didn't have to worry about profit or the constraints of capitalism, because I didn't know any better, right? I was 23. I didn't actually understand a lot of these things like margins. What would I build and how would I do it? My first business plan, for some context, was a pie chart, like to prove how little I understood about business. I was like, that makes sense, yes. But I think what that allowed me to do is reimagine. And what we reimagined is that by the end of this year, so 4 years in, by the end of this year, every single one of our farm workers will have access to healthcare, and that we pay this average of 6x, that every single jar that we put out in the world has a harvest date, a milling date, and a best by date, which no other spice company in the world does. So, and that we're, you know, a BIPOC and queer-led team trying to really lean into our identities, not as like places of scarcity, but like how do our identities kind of empower us? Like, how does the fact that I am an Indian from India allow me to be a really thoughtful translator of Indian culture or South Asian culture now, because we're also working with other places like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, to really translate like what the farmer is saying, what their experiences are to the American consumer. So yeah, that's my ramble. There were some very thoughtful questions. How am I on time, Pooja? Decent?
You're good. You have about, you can go another 7, 8 minutes if you want.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had like little notes regarding
Yeah.
Pooja sent over very thoughtful questions about, you know, what are your theories of change and what does authenticity mean to you? And I think that this question of what does authenticity mean to you as an entrepreneur is like one that I've been thinking about a lot, because in the food landscape and the food media landscape we're sitting in right now, it can be a very loaded term. Like authenticity can also be an easy way to trap BIPOC founders and folks into kind of ideas of what can be authentic, and therefore you can only do that. So it's like if you're seen as you know, an authentic Thai chef, then you wouldn't be good at making pasta. Or if you're an authentic Indian, then it couldn't be that your comfort food is Korean food, or that you might be an expert in, I don't know, something else that's not related to an Indian identity. So I think my idea of authenticity is really be rooting down into origin. Where does something come from? Who grows it? Who eats it? Who has power in the equation? And then really, I guess, being as careful as possible in terms of translating that to your customer from a business standpoint. I mean, I have always told stories well. That's always what I've done. Like, so much of what I do is marketing and storytelling for the brand. And I think I don't call us an authentic spice business, because what does that mean, right? Like, a nutmeg came from Indonesia to India via the British because they wanted to conquer the Dutch. And like, I inherited that nutmeg from a market that was owned by the French. So like, authentic doesn't mean much, but I think authentic means telling that story of how the nutmeg went from Indonesia to India, you know, to the French market, and what forces of colonialism and power made that happen. In terms of kind of as an entrepreneur who I think is very, I'm an accidental entrepreneur is what I like to say, I think, because I started this as an art project, like really an experiment in equity. But now I'm a leader, and I've definitely stepped into my role as a businesswoman. So there's a lot that keeps me up at night, because this tension between your bottom line and profit and cash flow and all these scary words and payroll, and then equity and impact and decolonization, like those are the exciting words. I think it's the main thing for me is like constantly challenging what those big words mean. So for example, it's very easy to say that we are rooted in equity as a business, but in 2020, that meant an average of 4x that we paid on to farmers on the commodity price. In 2019, that meant providing healthcare. In 2020 and 2021, it's thinking about ownership strategies and like how that'll work in the future. So I think I'm keen to not get caught as we scale, to not get caught up in the big words that just sound nice and you can kind of coast on, and instead constantly be pushing forward, so that, because as you grow, there's constantly new things you'll be able to unlock in terms of what you can do for your partners. So that's been a good, big one, is not wanting to be stagnant. And then another one is, I think, staying rooted in the work. Like, what is the work at any given time? Like right now, the work is going from 20 spices to 30 spices, right? Without worrying about, will you be imitated? How will you be perceived? Who is using the same words as you? I think it's very easy for me to get bogged down in like all the other people and the noise and what they're doing. And I think it becomes a really important thing every morning to sit down and be like, actually, in order to support more farmers, pay farmers better, what is the work today? And that's it, and focus on that. And then the third one is really how to be a good leader, right? Like I've had one full-time job for 7 months before I started my own company. AKA I had very little work experience, and then was a solo entrepreneur for a long time, like had 3 employees up until early last year, and now we're at 10. And so without having role models that look like me, that match my identities, that I grew up seeing, how do I lead? And I think, there's a lot of ways to do that and a lot of exciting ways to do that, but it's definitely a scary thing.
Senna, you have maybe talk a little bit about just, you're very humble, and you definitely exude your gentle confidence without attitude, which is one of our defining principles at Berkeley. But talk about your strategy. I mean, this is such an interesting moment. There's all of these people now during the pandemic. People are cooking at home more than ever. Talk a little bit about, you're really masterful at telling these stories, but you also have like a very, I would say, sophisticated, business and marketing strategy behind your storytelling. So maybe reveal for the class a little
How
bit,
that happens.
and how it happened.
Yeah. So I knew that well, actually, I'll dial it back one step really quick, which is that initially the strategy was going to be, hey, if people want turmeric lattes, I can find an incredible brown farmer who should make money off of these lattes. And so my strategy was, let's sell to wellness companies. Let's make sure that if they want to sell this woo-woo thing, we have a really thoughtful source that they can hype up and talk about. But I quickly realized that wellness, because it's so much about you will get healthy and you will grow stronger, and like it's so individualistic, that it wasn't the right home for this almost like circle of care and community around spices that we were trying to build. So we pivoted quite aggressively early on, where we were like, we will not focus on wellness. We will actually focus on community and the food community and home cooks, like anybody that cares about good olive oil or good coffee. They're people we want to talk to about good spices and what that can do for them. And a lot of wholesalers were unwilling to sell our product in 2017 and 18 because who's going to buy $12 spices. And so I started writing this newsletter, and it was once a month, pretty in depth, a lot of feelings. And I think over time, that newsletter has grown and grown and grown, where I still write it. I still write it every month. And we have, I think, like a 65% open rate for about 80,000 people at this point, who dedicatedly read it, which also means that if we launch a spice with several thousand units, we sell out of it within minutes, because there's people who believe in this and who I've been talking to literally one-on-one for 3 years now, and telling them about our growth, our challenges, the times when things are really hard, the time when our farmers get screwed over, or when there's a drought, or when they lose their harvest. So I think what I wanted to do is like I'm always very homesick for India and where I come from. So what I initially wanted to do was bring my two worlds of India and the US closer together. And I guess I've become that person who does that by writing this newsletter and doing this storytelling. And I think that pivot to, we want to focus on home cooks, paid off very quickly, because we realized that, direct to consumer gives you the opportunity to build community in a much deeper way than if you're on a grocery store shelf. Like, a spice bottle is this tiny. How do you tell the story of hundreds of years of colonization and conquest and culture on this tiny bottle? Whereas a website page beautifully does that. And so at this point, we're like 98% direct to consumer, and like we'll probably stay that way for a while, just because we love it and we love what it's able to do.
So not only do you forge this closer bond with your eaters, your customers, but also the business dynamics of selling direct to consumer are sort of enhanced cash flow. You're getting your money when,
A
people
lot
order
bigger
it.
margins.
Yeah, a lot bigger margins. So, and then some real efficiency through the work that you do, because everything you do is so beautiful and colorful and engaging to the eye. You're really optimizing these channels, the multimedia channels that are basically available to everyone. And you've managed to figure out how to break through. So whenever I see your post on Instagram, it's just instantly recognizable.
Thank you.
How does
We're
she do
not on TikTok yet, but we'll get there.
Okay, we won't rush you. All right, well, Sana, thank you so much. We'll have you back in a discussion shortly. So thanks again. I would love to introduce, and I should just tell our speakers, I'm not telling a lot about your company or your background in my introduction, because the students have all read these wonderful profile pieces about you this week as part of the pre-read. So I don't want to steal more of your time. But Jorge is the founder of Masienda. And as you know, Alice Waters very early, I think in the semester, mentioned Jorge as an example of kind of a systems entrepreneur that was solving a number of problems. And I think one of the things that makes Jorge's journey so interesting is and he'll tell you about this, but it's where he had the aha moment. And I think you'll see from all three of our entrepreneurs tonight that by being placed in a certain position, with some context and insight, they were able to recognize and seize an opportunity. So please join me in welcoming Jorge. Where are you, Jorge? There.
Thanks so much, Will. And I have to say, Sana, I'm such a fan. I'm like so happy we got to connect very fortuitously this way, because we have you as like a brand icon in our office as we start diving into
I was inspired by you when I started Diaspora. There's a really embarrassing email I wrote you in 2017.
Wait, what? Okay,
I'll send it to you.
Okay, that'd be great. That'd be great. Yeah, what you've been able to do in such a short amount of time is like really, truly extraordinary. And you're very fearless. For anybody who doesn't know, I love watching how just like once you put yourself out there, and it pushes me, who's a very shy, introverted person. So thanks for what you do. So Pooja, if this isn't working for any reason, let me know. I made a small sort of deck here. Let's see if I can get this. I'm pretty new to Zoom, guys. All right. And is this working? Yeah. All right.
It's working.
Great. Amazing. Okay, great. So I feel like I had to kind of, I took Will's class a couple years back through the CIA and felt like I had to kind of get my act together because I was just, I didn't even have a pie chart back then. So really we've come a long way. I wanted to, I think, anchor the conversation with one of the questions that was posed by Will and Pooja, which is what drew me to the food industry. And I think this is just a huge area to unpack, and it gets at a lot of what we're talking about here between all three companies. But if you'll allow me, this is something I actually talk about mostly to my therapist. So it's funny to now talk about this with, you know, like 100 something people. But I do find that it's pretty insightful because, you know, I think there's something about this journey that is in a lot of journeys that I recognize. And for me, at least, I hope it can help sort of illuminate your own path at best. If not, hopefully it's entertaining. So we'll start on a psychological level with this really blurry image of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think if you think about it, if you're not familiar with it, it's basically sort of motivational psychology, what motivates us to do and act in this world. And there's sort of a three-tiered system to this approach. At the very sort of bottom are, you know, a human's basic need to survive, instinctually find security, food, shelter. Once we've established that, we kind of go for the next thing, which is like acceptance, right? You know, psychological needs need to be met. We establish relationships with friends, you know, intimate partners, things like that. And then with any luck, we kind of, in a very linear, ideal way, we get to this top of self-actualization where we meet, you know, our true potential, we tap into the inner creativity that we have and really kind of realize, you know, who we are destined to be. And, you know, my story with starting Masienda is really not too different from that. It started with a very basic human need, which was, you know, a hunger. I grew up, you know, not really sure where my next meal was going to come from, honestly. And, you know, I think as a kid, just the extraordinary amount of pleasure I got from eating was a sort of an easy hook. But I wanted to really care for myself in that way, be able to not only survive, but also thrive and just find pleasure from food and be in control of that lever. And so I started in the most sort of like primitive sort of way I could think of. I went farming and I did a butchering apprenticeship in Italy. This is, I really wasn't trying to accentuate my forearm. It was just the least grotesque version of like a butchering shot I could find in my archives here. But I spent some time in Italy, about a year, working as a farming and butchering apprentice on a 1,200 acre organic estate, which is about as amazing as it sounds. It was a really life-changing opportunity for me to just kind of understand where food comes from and also just establish kind of an understanding of how much range there is in food in terms of a career. You know, I was working as a butcher's apprentice. I was working in winemaking. I was doing education. You know, there's obviously food media. There were just so many different areas of interest for me, and it really started to kind of map out those potential you know, avenues. But once I established kind of that understanding of sort of where food comes from, how to survive in the wild, so to speak, I kind of started thinking about what was that next step, and the psychological needs, that kind of desire to find a place in a social environment. And I think you know, I started actually working at a restaurant called Maialino in New York, which is a Danny Meyer restaurant, if you're not familiar with it, a really lovely Roman restaurant. And he, you know, I think the second I got there, I understood kind of this sense of belonging that Anthony Bourdain explained so beautifully, which I'm kind of blocking now on my Zoom thing, but I'll read it to you. So he said, "I'm asked a lot what the best thing about cooking for a living is, and it's this: to be part of a subculture, to be part of a historical continuum, a secret society with its own language and customs, to enjoy the instant gratification of making something good with one's hands, using all one's senses. It can be at times the purest and most unselfish way of giving pleasure." He then goes on to share some expletives that I won't put in there, but you know, this was true as soon as I got there. You know, this sense of belonging to a tribe in the restaurant industry. If you've worked in the restaurant industry, you know this. If you know, you go into a restaurant and you make $10 an hour, which is talking about hierarchy of needs. I don't even know how my basic needs were met on that kind of pay scale, but I survived. but just the feeling of being kind of in that tribe was such an important aspect of that progression. But, I think to kind of what we're talking about today, there was always something more. And it was sort of, to me, what's next, always what's next. And the epitome of kind of where I wanted to go was something that was really rooted in entrepreneurship for sure, but service and education. And, before I got into food, I worked as a teaching fellow in AmeriCorps in Brooklyn and working with at-risk youth. And it was, still is probably the most humbling experience I've ever had in my life, next to Masienda. But, the experience of teaching through food was something I found I constantly relied on. It was, whether I was teaching a course on science or history or whatever it was, food was a way to kind of bring people in. And it was just a tremendously powerful tool for achieving impact in this, community that I was in. And so, I don't want to jump ahead there. It's Meryl Streep. I will say that I started working at Blue Hill at Stone Barns, kind of with a hunch that I would be able to learn some things there and that would inform my journey. And as I started working there, I realized I had learned something in college, which was sort of like Marxist philosophy around this idea of cultural diffusion and how things kind of start and trickle down, in this case, like the bourgeoisie, and trickles down throughout the rest of culture. And, it always reminded me of The Devil Wears Prada, which I think actually does a much better job than Marxist philosophy about talking about this idea. If you've seen The Devil Wears Prada, you may remember there's this like Oscar-worthy moment. I think actually Meryl Streep won an Oscar for probably this scene, but Anne Hathaway kind of looks around this room. It's loosely based on what's her name, Anna Wintour, right? So she's like this like fashion power player. Anne Hathaway's in her kind of like what is it, lumpy blue sweater, as Meryl Streep calls it, and she basically like calls out this sort of high-minded fashion stuff, and sort of like low-key mocks it. And Meryl Streep is like, basically puts her in her place and says, what you don't know is that blue sweater that you would just call blue is actually cerulean blue. And years ago, this was something that was debuted on the Oscar de la Renta runway. And so at the end of the day, you think you're not participating, but it took that progression to reach the actual clearance bin that you bought this from, for you to be able to partake in the same thing that you say you're not a part of, right? So you're inextricably linked, whether you know it or not. And it's the very people in this room that made that decision. And it's just so powerful, right? Like you can think of any vertical across culture, and that's a real, that rings true. So I call this Merrill's Law. And Merrill's Law is sort of becomes the theory of change that I start to kind of use to think about Masienda. How can I leverage this reality of that chefs, when applied to food, not just fashion, how can chefs really help drive change in our food system? And what are the things that I really want to change? And, I'll give you a quick example without getting too far into it. As a case study, I worked for Dan Barber at Blue Hill at Stone Barns, which was a really powerful experience. I was there for some amazing conversations as he was writing his book and kind of developing his thesis. And, if you've eaten kale in the last like 15 years, it's probably because of Dan Barber to some degree, like kale salads or, talk about wellness. Like a lot of this has to do with kind of with conversations and the dishes he was serving up there. I use sweet green as an example there. There's a koji nut squash, which is a vegetable that he created with some seed breeders and ended up debuting on this mainstream menu. That's incredibly well-funded, venture-backed sweet green institution powerhouse that it is. I thought there was this amazing dance that happened every night. Indra Nooyi, who is the former CEO of Pepsi, she would come in regularly, and I would just see the conversations that were taking place between a server and her about, single udder butter or something. It sounds sort of as ridiculous as that, but like that had a real true story behind it and a connection to a greater purpose. And you would see these things written in her newsletters weeks later, and somehow find their way into strategy at Pepsi, however loosely, but, it would translate into mainstream culture. And so for me, the thing that I wanted to start thinking about was, what are the things that I grew up with that, weren't represented in culture, and certainly the type of environment that I was in at Blue Hill. What were the foods that, to me stood to really be illuminated in a way that I think created a new story and sort of a new perception around them. And to me, I think like naively, without a pie chart, pick the hardest thing I could possibly think of, which was masa. If you don't know what masa is the, man, it's already like, I'm already losing people. Masa is the base of basically, I mean, hundreds, thousands of Latin American dishes, most famously tortillas, but tamales, pupusas, arepas, tostadas. These are, it's sort of it's a special corn dough that goes through this process. We'll talk about another time if you want, that honestly, just like no one knows about. You know, most people, when you think of masa, they think of maseca, which is sort of the, like was it like a proprietary pseudonym, or what is it? Anyway, like Kleenex is to tissue as maseca is to masa. You know, maseca is, you know, in pretty much any tortilla you've probably had in the last, you know, your lifetime, including some of these brands that I featured up here. Even local tortillerias that you think are just really local and romantic are usually using maseca. And it's, as I started to understand that supply chain and understand this food that I sort of took for granted, you know, all throughout my adulthood and certainly growing up, I thought it was just such a compelling intellectual challenge to pursue. And so, you know, you think it's a niche product. In some ways it is. It's a $12 billion industry in the United States that, you know, whether we acknowledge it or not, I mean, most of us are consuming this and just don't know the difference, right? So I thought that was a really compelling problem to solve on a consumer level. But, you know, I wasn't quite sure of how we were going to drive that impact home. And I started doing a lot of research on the foodway, of course, and which led me to Mexico. And the problem really presented itself there, which is that there are 3 million smallholder farmers in Mexico who live, you know, at or below the international poverty line. And these are folks who, you know, have actually ironically or paradoxically, happen to be sourcing or I should say preserving the highest quality corn in the world, things that chefs go crazy about. And, you know, much like spices. The interesting thing about this is that, you know, they have been, since 1994, these farmers have been at a significant disadvantage through the passing of NAFTA. They have not been able to compete with international prices in the commodity market. You know, this has created a lot of insolvency at the farm level, which has unsurprisingly forced a lot of folks to find work elsewhere, you know, and this is sort of the root of a lot of the migration that we see across the border, which doesn't matter what your political beliefs are, there's something that's happening there. And there's at least a way to level that playing field if you're providing an economic incentive for folks to grow what they grow and they do the best at. And, you know, for me, when I saw that problem and then I tasted, frankly, just the range of flavors that I had been missing throughout my childhood and adulthood, it all added up and it checked a lot of boxes. Kind of core values of what I saw there being able to really meet was, you know, supporting biodiversity, which, you know, is critical to our ability to enjoy flavor, to enjoy, you know, to be able to partake in culture is to really dive deep into biodiversity. And in the absence of that, we just, you know, we're at such a loss. Sustainable agriculture, I mean, this predates regenerative organic by thousands of years. These are folks who've been doing the right kind of agriculture for millennia, and they've never had certifiers. They've never had somebody telling them, you know, to do this. This is just the way it's traditionally done. And of course, farmers like, you know, Don Pedro, who for us, you know, they are the stewards of this process. We wanted to be able to support what they do. And so going back to Merrill's law, you know, where do you start in food? You know, you start with chefs. And so I connected the supply chain, which started out with a group of about 12 farmers with chefs, you know, which thanks to my experience at Blue Hill and Stone Barns, I was easily able to connect with Daniela Soto Inés, Enrico Vera, Jose Andres, folks here in the backyard in Berkeley. We've got Dominica Rice at Cosecha, we've got Nopolito, and of course, Alice Waters. And they've helped since 2014 kind of help share this story of what the potential of masa can be on a much larger scale. And, you know, the hope was that at a certain point, that story would hit critical mass to where we could launch consumer packaged goods of some kind that would meet a home cook, you know, not just a chef. So essentially creating an active consumption experience for home cooks as opposed to passive with them going to a restaurant that we're serving and sourcing for. So, you know, from that point on, we, you know, between 2014 and I guess around 2017, we really were laying the foundation for that. And since then, we've essentially launched what is sort of like the third wave masa equivalent to third wave coffee. So if you think about third wave coffee, you know, some of the key aspects of that, whether it's Blue Bottle or counterculture coffee or Stumptown. Acute attention to sourcing, all single origin, direct relationships with farmers. Coffee is not quite as direct as what we're doing, and I think what also Diaspora is doing, but I think it was a starting point in the conversation. They're also, creating value to the coffee from green coffee, and they're roasting it. They're providing the machinery and the equipment to get this done at a home level or at a professional level. We do all of that for Masa. So we do everything from producing tortillas to masa harina to like literally the first countertop mill that's ever been made for masa that won't kill you, I hope. So to date, we started working with 12 farmers. We work with about a network of 2,000 farmers today in Mexico, and all folks who are kind of covering a range of states, but live in that sort of that socioeconomic background I was mentioning, of sort of at or below the poverty line. So a huge amount of impact. We've been able to funnel not just through the purchasing of corn, but primarily employing folks over there year over year and growing that resource for them through the cottage industry of heirloom corn. We've been able to inject about $2.25 million into the various places we work in the communities, and sourced more than 6 million pounds of heirloom corn to date, which is like a number that even going through it today is surreal to think about. But yeah, I think the long story short is that while starting with something that was sort of very selfish and survivalistic in a sense, to come from that in the very beginning to this sort of, self-actualization sounds like a little cheesy, but like it really has been quite a progression. And I think for me, I can't imagine working anywhere else.
Thank you. So inspiring. It's so good to see you again. And you've come so far since you didn't have a pie chart, but you did have a tortilla.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
We're going to take a little bit of a break now, and then we're going to have Larissa tell her story. I wanted to invite everyone to think about questions that you might have for Sana and Jorge, and think about posting those in the chat, maybe during the break or in the next little while. What we're going to do is take a break. We're going to start again at 7:07. We're going to come back in 10 minutes, and then we'll have Larissa talk. Then we're going to have a little breakout to our homerooms to explore a question. And then we'll come back and take attendance, just so you know to pay attention then. And then we'll have a discussion with our guests tonight. So onward, see you back at 7 minutes after 7. Thanks. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good break. We're going to continue on. I'd like to now introduce to you Larissa Russell, one of the co-founders of Pod Foods. And if you got a chance to read about Larissa's journey, it's quite amazing to learn from one experience and then pivot rapidly into solving probably a much greater problem at a very key leverage point that became sort of even more important during the pandemic, especially. So Larissa, without further ado, please let's welcome Larissa.
Thank you, Will. So in case you didn't get a chance to look at my background, no worries. My name is Larissa, and I'm the CEO of Pod Foods, which is a B2B marketplace and distribution network for brands. So first of all, I'm really excited to try both of your products, the spices and the tortillas. They both look amazing. So we connect brands and retailers, and basically we help grocery stores source those kinds of brands, all the best brands for their store. And we facilitate the end-to-end logistics so that ultimately we can rival the incumbent grocery supply chain, which is outdated and holding back a lot of innovation and making it incredibly challenging for awesome entrepreneurs to succeed. So before I talk a little bit more about that, I recognize that it's a little bit random to hear this coming out of my mouth. Like, why did I discover this problem? Why am I doing this company? And the truth is, I did have that aha moment with my co-founder, Fiona, where we woke up one evening, late at night. And we decided we're definitely going to do this business. But there were lots of things that happened before then. And I'll just backtrack a little bit because it started out by me having absolutely no idea what I wanted to do with my job, with my life, with my career. I didn't even know what a career was. I still don't, because it's all changing, right? So I was sitting there and I had studied government and economics, and I was thinking, oh no, when I graduate from college, I'm going to be standing in the middle of the road with no path. And all of my friends are going into investment banking and consulting and are going to go be a lawyer or a doctor. And here I am with nothing. And so I wallowed for a little bit. And then I realized that I should just do something, figure out something that feels exciting. And basically everything that unfolded for me was because I was following something that felt exciting. So what felt exciting for me at the time was to move out to California and do something totally unrelated. Because, I thought I was going to be a diplomat and go into government or, do whatever I wanted to do. No. So I moved out to California. I got a job at a startup as an analyst, and I was basically just like pulling queries out of their database and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And there I met this guy named Sean, who that's not even his real name, but he was from Singapore and people couldn't pronounce his real name. So he made up the name Sean. And he brought these green pea cookies from Singapore over to the US, and he gave them to the office. And he was interning with us there for a year. And I had this job for about a year, maybe even less, but I tried the green pea cookies and I liked them. And so with Sean, we partnered with my now co-founder, Fiona, and the three of us had this cookie company. We were out there hustling our products. We made cookies out of peas and they were very on trend, this plant-based, awesome little pea light. We had lots of pea puns and we wanted to create something better for the world, just like so many out there, creating something that's better for the environment, better for the people that are making the products and so on, like you just heard about. And in doing so, we ran into the many, many challenges of the food industry. And as we usually talk about with the company, basically we were out there trying to get our products into retail stores. And we had been selling online, we were direct to consumer. We sold to companies that resold the product or gave it away to their employees if it was a free food at work situation. Lots of companies give their employees free food. And that was fine. But we kept getting this feedback like, hey, we want to buy your cookies in the grocery store, or you should put these in Whole Foods. And so we went out there and we learned what that would take and what that would entail. And basically, there are these distributors in the supply chain that as a manufacturer, you would then sell to. You make a whole bunch of pallets of product, usually by hand when you're just starting out at like 3 a.m. in the commercial kitchen that you're renting space for by the hour. And you're building these pallets and you ship them off to the wholesaler. And then you basically have no information from there with the incumbent existing distribution system. The middlemen are not incentivized to share any information. So they buy your product at a low price and then they go and mark it up and resell it to a bunch of grocery stores. So when you go into the grocery store, most of that product has been sourced from these middlemen, these distributors. There are lots of middlemen in the supply chain. I'm kind of oversimplifying it a bit. But the bottom line is, for a manufacturer like us, it was unaffordable and unappealing. Unappealing because it was bad service, as we've heard many, many times from many entrepreneurs that had gone ahead of us. They kept saying it's a necessary evil. And unaffordable because you had absolutely no information about where the products were being sold. And so we were looking at this, and it was in San Francisco, and there was an app for everything. And we're like, there's got to be an app for this. And so we're all around looking for an app. How can we just get into grocery stores in a way that's just as easy as selling online? And there was no way. There was nothing. And so we started to investigate it. And again, it came back to, yes, we were facing the problem ourselves as a cookie maker, but ultimately it went down to what was feeling exciting for us as entrepreneurs. And we were really excited about learning about this problem and talking to people about it and figuring out how we can do it better for our cookie company first. And then ultimately we decided, hey, this is a better path for us. And so we decided to shut down the cookie business and create this distribution company called Pod Foods, which is basically a B2B marketplace. So we connect brands and retailers on a platform where brands then list their product, they list their specifications, UPC code, everything the retailers would need to know. And the retailer can go place orders. But underneath all of this is this core functionality that traditional distributors otherwise cover, which is logistics. And it is a very age-old industrial not sexy industry, right? And so we were moving away from this really fun branded product into dealing with logistics providers and trying to make this thing happen and building technology. So that was really exciting for two young entrepreneurs that had no idea what they were doing, but knew what they were doing. Like, we were looking at the solution. We weren't busy like focusing on the problem and everything we didn't have going for us. And so we built this fulfillment network where basically when a retailer places an order, they can receive one consolidated delivery for that order, which mirrors the experience that they would get ordering from a traditional distributor. But we've done it in a whole different way. And I'm happy to dig into the details if you guys are interested in that piece. But that's what we do at a high level. And basically, it enables us to take on the grocery supply chain, which was exciting to us and appealing to us because there are so many hundreds of thousands of amazing brands out there. Everything from like what we had, a cute little cookie company, all the way to plant-based meat alternatives that you found in Yellowstone, growing fungi and things like that. And they all have so much potential to make a huge change in the grocery space, the food industry, not only in grocery, but also in food service. And consumers want them. That's why these brands exist. But the grocery supply chain is really inhibiting change because the distributors are not incentivized to work with smaller brands. And not only are they not incentivized, but once those brands are large enough to work with those grocery suppliers, the supply chain is not a right-sized supply chain, which means it's not data-driven. And so we saw an opportunity to leverage data to create an entire grocery supply chain that's driven by consumer demand, even though our ultimate end customer is the retailer. So that's our big picture, and that's what we're striving for. Right now, what we've built is we've created the distribution network like I described, and we're in Northern and Southern California, the greater Midwest, Texas, New York, we started in Hawaii. So it's been a lot of growth over the 2020 and also 2019 and now 2021. But it wasn't always easy. And I think the main reason still ties back into feeling excited about it. The times when it wasn't easy, it's easy to look at it and be like, oh, that's why I wasn't excited. But I really think it's the opposite way, where if you can feel excited about it, then things start to pick up momentum and speed and you can find things to solve for. But if you're feeling this lethargy, like, oh no, what am I doing? That gets in front of you. And it ultimately, your company is just going to stagnate for a little bit, or you're going to run into challenges. The main thing that I deal with as a CEO is raising money. So the company part, honestly, the path has unfolded for us quite smoothly. And it's not like it's without challenges, right? But for two people who had never gone to business school, never studied this stuff, it's always so fortuitous to encounter the right people that join our team and have that experience that we don't have and are able to provide a perspective that we otherwise wouldn't have. And we know where our gaps are and we know what we don't know. And we've been able to fill that in and create this thing that's gaining momentum. The piece that I focus on is fundraising. And so it's being able to convey that entire story to a group of investors. It's definitely interesting, and it's been this process where I left college feeling very confident in myself, even though I was confused about what I was doing with my life. And I left high school feeling the same way. And I think the main thing that it came down to was that I never doubted who I was. I never let what the society or the world thought of people like me, whatever that means, dictate my perspective of myself. And basically, through my young adulthood, I've been in the process of refinding that again, because you're thrown into this system that doesn't believe in you, doesn't care about you. And the only thing that you can do is not let that get into your head. There are a million reasons why this company won't succeed. There are a million reasons why my co-founder and I wouldn't be able to raise money, right? Like, we have no experience, we're not technical, we're female, we look like little kids. But why should I focus on all the reasons why I won't succeed? So instead, we continue to focus on all of the solutions and just continue to push for all of the positive solutions that we can. And that's really comes back to the authenticity piece. I think, we connect brands and we connect retailers. So obviously branding is an important thing. But when it comes to being a person, I think the entrepreneurship side is really about who you are as a person. So your company has a brand, but I've always struggled with the idea of creating a brand for myself, because ultimately you're a growing person, you change, you evolve, you have new ideas. And myself, my identity. There's so much conversation now about race and gender identity and all these things. I guess I feel fortunate because when I was growing up, I never even considered it because I'm so mixed, racially and nationality, the whole thing. I'm a mutt. And so while I was able to celebrate cultures, I never identified as one of them. I was always just myself. And so when I come out into the world and when we come out into the world as co-founders, it's always about how can we just show up as ourselves? Because ultimately, as an entrepreneur, you want people on your board who respect you as you. Just how you go and find friends. You don't go brand yourself to find a friend. You go and you connect with that person. So it's all about connection. Even though, of course, the company must have an identity and it must have a brand that people can connect with because it's a little bit more systematic than being a human being. So yeah, and one more point about that. One of my main points of excitement about Green Pea Cookie was that it just felt so good. We had no idea what we were doing, but we were naming our cookies and we were creating all of these different kinds of cookie products like Pearl, the Earl Grey green pea cookie, or Peter, the original green pea cookie. And we wrote stories and all these things. It wasn't a great business, but it was definitely a great brand. And it felt exciting. People liked it. We were selling all over the place online. But ultimately, the status quo kind of crushed that thing, crushed that spirit. And what I'm excited for with Pod Foods is enabling people who have awesome ideas, not only for the environment and humanity, but also just being themselves in the world. I'm excited about creating something that can make that profitable because profit aligning with purpose is really what you're going to need for lasting change. If you want to create something that's just really good and nice, that's awesome. But if people aren't able to sustain that with money, then it can only go so far or you continue to support that and it doesn't really create any economy. So that's what I'm excited about with regards to authenticity. And finally, Pooja also asked me what keeps me up at night. And I wanted to say that I've learned over time that sleep is important. And back in the day, things did keep me up at night a lot more than they do now because I was just so stressed. I was thinking, well, I need the money to make this happen so that I can feel good, or I need this sale to go through so that we can launch LA and then I can feel good, or we need this person to hire. And I've decided that it's time to just feel good and take care of myself. And then the things follow, because why wait? And why give your power away to somebody else or to some situation that you can't control? And by flipping that around, it actually flips everything around where you can go out and things start to turn around for you. So that's that. It's always a struggle. It's not like I have it all figured out. Every day is a challenge, but it's been good. That's my entrepreneurial journey in food so far.
Thank you, Larissa. That's really inspiring. Really appreciate that. We're going to put everybody into a breakout now for their homeroom. And we've got a little prompt for you. Would just love for you to have 5-6 minutes to talk with one another, share what's resonating with you, put on your pattern recognition hats and think about what you saw that was in common between Sana and Jorge and Larissa's entrepreneurial journeys. Maybe think about, did they express clear visions? Take it back to maybe some of the context and language that you've been using in the course and maybe working on with your homework assignment. So do they convey a clear and compelling vision? In what way have they overcome obstacles? Just we'll put you in breakouts for about 6-7 minutes, and then we'll come back and we're going to build some word clouds. And when we build the word clouds, that will be our way of just very efficiently taking attendance too. And then we'll come back and have a little bit more discussion with our guests. So enjoy your peers. All right. Welcome back, everyone. We're now going to build a word cloud together. We're just really interested to get your impressions. Eva is going to post the link, correct, for the word cloud. And the question that we would like you to respond to is what patterns did you observe from our guests' entrepreneurial journeys? So if you can click on that, this is really fun, Jorge, to see this come to life with 100 and something participants in unison. Very nice. Thank you all for participating in this. We'll let it go a few more iterations. All right, hopefully everybody's gotten their codes in. Let's give you just another 10 seconds to contribute because I want to do one more. Okay, perfect. We'll save that one and we'll share it. And then Eva, we've got one more. I just wanted to get kind of a quick impression from you. What one word describes, what did I say before, Eva? You wrote it down. What one word describes the way you feel about tonight's class or presentations? What one word describes how you feel about tonight's class presentations? Oh, that's good. That's what we were hoping for.
Imagine if somebody said bored, we'd never know.
It could be really tiny. You have to look really close. Yay is on there. I like that. Love. In awe. That's nice. Commitment to the craft. Warm, capable, optimistic, totally inspired, compelled. Hungry. That's a normal one during our evening. Invigorated. Good. Well, then we'll go maybe another 5 or 10 seconds here, but thank you all. Let's bring our guests back and maybe we can figure out how to spotlight us all so we look like we're sitting together there in that auditorium like we once do. That's great. You know, I want to delve in well, first of all, students, class, this is such a warm, accessible, authentic, kind, loving group of guests that I really hope you'll come forward with some good questions. And I'm going to turn to Pooja and Eva to help sort of tee those up in a minute. But I wanted to go into a little bit more detail because we were throwing around this term supply chain. And we haven't really, you know, we've heard that a lot this semester, but we haven't really delved into it. So maybe each of you could really describe what is your supply chain? What is the supply chain that you care about? When you use the word supply chain, what do you really mean? And try to be as specific as possible because each of you are dealing with really different nuances of a supply chain. So Sana, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I did not know the word supply chain until 3 years ago, and here we are. It's all over my life. So in our case, supply chain means that first we have to find and decide on which farm partner that we're going to work with. That initially begins with receiving samples from all over South Asia. So we recently launched cloves and we received about 14 different clove samples from regenerative farms across the country. But then we received this one sample from Sri Lanka, which was just like miles and miles better than anything else we'd received from India. So now we work with Sri Lanka. But so the sample is the first thing, right? It's like establishing quality and flavor. But then in that first peg in our supply chain, what we're looking for is values. Do our farm partners, are they stewards of the land? Do they care? Are they in it or growing sustainably because that's in their nature, because they care about it, or because, you know, apparently you get a premium, or I don't know, some buyer told them that that's what's necessary. So we start at the farm level, and then we quickly realize that the most delicious spices are often not grown by the people who have the capacity to export themselves, or actually then get it to us in the United States. So I started an export company in Mumbai. That is one of the hardest things I have ever done. I don't recommend it to anybody. And just because Indian bureaucracy is so corrupt, spice exports out of India make up for 70% of agricultural exports for India. So it's a huge way for government officials to get bribes. So I had to, you know, really sit at these offices for anywhere from 3 to 5 days, just embarrassing them into clearing some of our initial paperwork. So we have an export company. I have an operations manager in India who will get on the phone with our farm partners and say, you know, is it ready? I'm sending a truck. And then we send it. And for some context, like India is very large. So we'll send a truck like in Manipur, which is on the Burmese border. And then that truck will like slowly make its way across the country. It'll hit the monsoon along the way. It'll hit a corrupt agent along the way. You never know what it'll hit along the way. In a pandemic last year, it hit a corrupt agent, like a state border agent who didn't want to leave his home without being fed a nice dinner in order to clear it. So we had to feed him a mutton dinner in order to clear it. He specified that mutton was his meat of choice. And then it gets to the port of Mumbai, and Syed, by like magic and hard work and sweat, will wrangle spice board certificates for it. And then it either gets on a ship or a flight. What we tend to do is we send a little bit by air, so that we have something, we have supply, and then the rest kind of chases by sea because that's much cheaper. And then when it gets here, we're the importer. So I'm part of this export company and part of this import company. And we import it into the country and then jar it and get it to our customers. And so that's our relatively short supply chain, but it feels like the longest, most mad supply chain to me.
Thank you. Can I just add in a couple of little steps that are technicalities, like
Yes.
a little organization called the FDA? And there's also, I think there's a quality control step in there too, right?
In terms of, yes, establishing that it's exactly what we received. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah,
There's
right.
lab testing that happens on both ends. So like we batch test every single sample that comes to us at the port of Mumbai. And that's roughly a $200 lab test. And then when it gets to the port of Oakland, we lab test it again. And they're both random samples. And then when it gets to the co-packer, they were doing a quality control step as well. So it's, yeah, lots of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jorge, do you want to sort of build on that? Now, is your product fresh when it comes to the, does it need to be refrigerated, I guess is my question after you work with it?
Yeah, I think so. In the beginning, I can relate a lot to Diaspora's supply chain. We go through the same level of corruption and just like insanity to get things from point A to point B. And it's especially like when a town doesn't have pallets, like how do you palletize something? You know, it's like the things we take for granted in supply chains. It's amazing. But our corn is dry shelled corn, so it's like not the kind you would want to eat without doing something to it first, like cooking it. Not to be confused with sweet corn, which is, you know, you can eat off the cob pretty much. It is interesting though, in our case, because, you know, corn we take for granted is basically, it's heavily sprayed with pesticides. And even in the organic industry, you know, there's loopholes around preservation and shelf stability. So we took a totally different route, which, you know, corn is perishable if you don't take steps to sort of deter pests, and usually it's the form of insects that kind of burrow into it and really love it. They're usually weevils, just a part of farming. It's a thing. But yeah, we use anaerobic bags, which were pioneered by the coffee industry, so like the third wave Masa coffee connection. they basically create an anaerobic environment so that bugs can't survive. And we usually have a disclaimer for anyone buying the corn that like, hey, just like an organic, bunch of lettuce, like you might find a bug in it from time to time. That's totally normal. It's a sign that we're using organic practices, which most people are cool with. As we expand, the conversation is a little bit trickier with customer service, but it's certainly a piece that I think is worth it and we're not willing to compromise on.
And can you tell us a little bit more about your distribution right now? You started obviously with this wonderful collective of high profile chefs.
Mm-hmm.
How, as you look at your different lines of distribution, how is it sort of evolving at this point?
Yeah, it's really complex. I mean, obviously with COVID, March was a really tough month for us last year. It's sort of the writing on the wall of restaurants closing. That was more than 50% of our business. We had aspirations of going into D2C, and I'm writing a book, almost done with the book, but it comes out next year, which we were sort of using as a launching ground for D2C. But this obviously hastened things quite a bit just for us to survive and make things happen. So that actually, unbelievably, and I'm curious to hear what everybody else's experience are. I mean, we thought it was just sort of an isolated COVID bump, like a pandemic, craze, and it's held at a really unbelievable rate. It's become the largest side of the business without a doubt, which is encouraging that once restaurants come back, hopefully, most can come back in some form or another. There's a real ecosystem now, and that connection between chefs and home cooks is now so much more apparent for us, and how to I think leverage that connection. So yeah, D2C has been huge. We do all of our own fulfillment. I know Diaspora does as well. And for pretty much anything you find online, for tortillas, that's a cold supply chain. We have to deliver that since we don't have preservatives. So it's all blast frozen and then distributed through Unify, I'm sorry. And then it gets to a shelf where it has a really short shelf life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really important for everybody to recognize that dynamic, because that makes business a lot more difficult. That cold chain is expensive all the way around, and the perishability is a pain point in terms of profitability and margin. So Larissa, besides software, what other kinds of capabilities have you had to build on the fly here to equip Pod to be effective?
Yeah, so we're concerned with the grocery supply chain. So once all the hard work is done by the manufacturers creating the product that's ready to go, that understands its specifications in terms of food safety and shelf life and all of that, now we're responsible for getting it to the grocery stores. And so Pod Foods is a B2B marketplace. We connect the brands and retailers on the software platform, but then we also facilitate the full service end-to-end logistics. So once the retailer places the order, we have to make sure that they get the order logistically. And how that looks is we've got a network of third-party logistics providers that are plugged into our software nationwide. We partner with these providers and we aggregate all of the suppliers that we work with. So all of these awesome brands, we bring them together and we get bulk deals in the warehouses so that each individual brand is not paying as much ultimately, but it's coming through us. So the brand will ship off however much inventory based on our forecasts to these various locations. We handle cold chain, we handle fresh, we handle all of it. And then basically when the retailer places the order through our software, the logistics providers pick and pack and deliver to the store according to our route optimization and so on. And it's all about just making sure the right product is in the right place at the right time. And it's all feeding back through the technology so that we can make sure that we're ahead of inventory and make sure that we're having better fill rates and so on for our retailers and brands.
So all three of you are really visionary founders with some kind of special connection to the field that you're in. How do you go about finding the talent that knows more than you do and bringing them into your organization? And when's the right time to do that? Go ahead.
I would say,
okay,
go ahead. I don't mean to talk out of turn, but nobody was saying anything.
Yeah.
I would say that it comes back to the needs of the company. And so when we first started out, it was just us. You have to do it yourself, and you have to figure it out. And then once you figure out the process, you can find somebody who can do it a lot better than you and take it to the next level. But if the need isn't there and you're overpopulating your company with really smart people, they have nothing to do. And if you have a really smart person with nothing to do, they're going to end up creating more problems than solutions. So we always approach hiring based on the growth. We let ourselves grow ahead. And then as the volume picks up and we need certain roles to emerge, then you bring on the team. Fortunately, in food, and I don't know if the others would agree, but people feel really passionately about the food industry. And so it's great to be able to attract talent for the reason we're in the company instead of just the function of their job.
Great. Thank you. Sana?
Oh, Jorge, did you want to go?
You go ahead, Sana.
Okay. In my case, it was, finding smarter people than you came from like finding early mentors who taught me how to do things I didn't know how to do. So one of the first people that I reached out to was Meridian Cacao, because using like Jorge, like using the models of cacao and chocolate, I wanted to build one for spices. And so I pretty much flew to Portland and was like, so Meridian, hello. Hi. How does one import? How do we do that? And Gino and Win were really, really helpful. And they literally printed like their FDA documents out for me and said, here's how you do it. And now 3 years later, Win, who I asked for help from in 2017, asked for a job from in 2016, is now my operations manager in 2021. So for me, investing in these food world relationships early on, or like I worked at Ovenly in New York in 2014, and they're now one of our wholesalers. And Aaron introduced me to Will, and Aaron's also a mentor to me. So I feel like finding these people, getting them invested in your story and in what you're trying to build, and then just making sure that it's a mutually beneficial thing. Like, I feel like I get so many messages every week at this point of like, I would love to pick your brain and like, And like, I remember being that person. So I'm very sympathetic to it, but also unless there's an ask or a warm intro, I don't have the time for it. And I guess one way that early on I offered that intro was telling people like, I'll take free photos for you, or like, I don't know, just like finding or going to an event and making the connection. So making myself useful early on, I guess.
Anything you want to add, Jorge, to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a critical question to the whole hiring piece is, if you're venture backed or not. And I think when you're venture backed, it clouds the picture a little bit. And I think in some ways it is a disadvantage to founders, or it can be a disadvantage to founders because you overhire, to what Larissa was saying, when there's not a need. And I do think hungry dogs hunt best. There needs to be a real, like, you need to feel that burn. You're continuously developing a muscle when you're working in a startup environment. And if that's not there, it's really hard to sustain momentum. So I think it's a fine balance. We've gone from like hiring too many people and realizing it too late and being like, shoot, we gotta let some people go. That was a really hard time for us when retail was not catching up with the momentum we had sort of envisioned. And now we have sort of PTSD from overhiring, and we've like really been slow to hire because we really want to make sure everybody has something that's really fulfilling for them to do. So it is a balance. It depends on certainly financing, but I think in our case, I'm learning to now understand, like, the more I can free my time up, the more I can help lead, and the more I can help kind of drive, overall productivity and new opportunities. So, yeah, I'm embracing the now hard-earned, rite of passage here of growing the team.
Good for you. Sana, a couple of the students, Jade and Carrie, would love to know a little more about what you look for in terms of farm or soil or regenerative practices when you're scouting for a farmer you might want to work with.
Yeah, actually, I think Jorge mentioned this really beautifully, in that like a lot of our farm partners were farming this way before any of these words became trendy, right? So like we're actually applying words to what they're doing that they don't maybe even agree with. Like we initially were saying that all of our spices were organically farmed, and we had a few farmers push back and say that, we see organic as a Western term that's like putting us into a box that we don't fit into. So when I say that I think we're sourcing for values, there's I was looking for, rather than like the big box organic certified farms, I ended up looking for people who were following something called ZBNF or SPNF, which in India stands for Zero Budget Natural Farming, or its former name was Subhash Palikar Natural Farming. And it's really an indigenous farming technique that was not developed, but like formalized by this old farmer. I think he's in his 80s. He's a bit kooky. His videos are a bit off. This man called Subhash Palikar, who just realized that adding inputs to his farm was just taking him deeper and deeper into debt. And so he wanted to share this model of zero budget, so zero input farming. And it spread like wildfire across the country. And so it's an automatic, if somebody believes in ZBNF, they're automatically pre-qualified for me because they believe in the same value system around zero inputs, around land stewardship. And Subhash Palikar himself, has been very helpful in that sourcing journey. At the same time, there's the Indian Institute of Spices Research in India, who I followed my best tactic of kind of showing up unannounced to them. And they are actually very commercial, organic. And I think I found that anybody that wasn't a good fit for them, like in terms of working together, any farmer that was butting up against ISR because they found ISR too commercial was usually like the perfect fit for me. And that's how we found our turmeric farmer, where he just felt that ISR's methods were not going far enough and like not helping farmers enough. So that's how we look. And yeah, it's all kinds of networks. I think the second part of the question is what kind of investments are being made in soil health and water availability. It's really hard. I think my biggest question this year and last year to our farm partners, new and old, is what is your access to irrigation? What are you investing from the premium that we're giving you in access to better irrigation for next year? Because otherwise, when there's a bad rain, because so many of these farms are purely rain fed or monsoon fed, it can be disastrous. Our Guntur Sanam chili, which is kind of one of our best sellers, we only got a fourth of the crop this year because of a bad rainy season. And so we're now trying to figure out how to bring drip irrigation and like rain ponds to the farms. So it's really challenging. And in terms of soil health, I think our farm partners are already like PhD level on that. That's why we work with them. They're experts.
Thank you. Great answer. Larissa, a question from John Chang. He's kind of interested in this dynamic that you've forged this really interesting entry in a niche, and you're working with early stage or emerging brands, but you're also surrounded by these gigantic companies. And so what happens to Pod Foods? Do you take those on? Do you partner with those big guys at some point, or do you start to lose your customers when they get big enough that they can actually work with a UNFI? How do you visualize this ecosystem as Pod grows and becomes more successful?
Yeah, so for context, UNFI is one of these gigantic middlemen that I was talking about earlier that buy and sell product. And so the nature of the incumbent business model is not aligning incentives, especially for this segment of the market. And what I mean by that is they own all the trucks, they own all the warehouses, they own each other. So they've gone out and they've bought up all the little distributors, and they own the inventory. So they buy the product, it sits there, and then they resell it. Lots of other things go on. But the main point that I'm trying to make is that they've got huge fixed costs. They've got a huge assets system. And so they're only profiting if they're distributing massive volume. The most profitable customers for them are the highest volume business and the highest volume business on both sides, the retailers and the brands. And so they're incentivized to focus on that because they have to answer to their shareholders. They have to focus on their most profitable business. So the cycle keeps repeating. That leaves a whole segment of brands that are underserviced. Even if they're accepted into UNFI or KHE or any of these big guys, they're not getting a great experience. They're going to, let alone the markups, because yeah, anybody can squeeze different markups out of the whole situation. There are tons of hidden fees and setup fees and lack of transparency that make it very difficult to work with these players. And so what we're doing is we're servicing the most underserved segment of the market first. And we're using that because it's the highest growing piece of the market as well to create a better experience for everybody in the grocery supply chain, whether you're a brand or a retailer. And we can service retailers of all sizes, chain stores, local stores, whatever it may be. And same with brands. We're just focusing on the high growth, long tail right now.
Wonderful. All right. How about one, there's a lot of good questions here, but one from Dalton. Just what's one piece of advice that you might give to a prospective founder or entrepreneur in this world of food that you've learned the hard way? Jorge, you got the biggest smile. You get to go first.
Thanks, Will. I would say, being very intentional about beginning with the end in mind, which is a classic, Stephen Covey ism there. But I think there was a lot of passion that brought me into doing this company. There was no end game at all, and of any kind, not financial or just like, the goal was like disrupt. And frankly, like I'm not even trying to do that anymore. I think there's a place for Masienda in culture. It's not my place, but I think that there's sort of an other segment to the market where that exists. So I think understanding those priorities and challenging yourself to do that in the beginning, it helps to have a coach, honestly, to help do that process as well. Advisors are a form of coaches. They can be a form of therapists if you want them to be. They oftentimes have equity and a real bias toward what your decisions are in some cases, oftentimes for the best, but not always. I think having that third party is a really important place to be able to be checking in with those priorities as you reach successive milestones. I didn't do that until more recently than I care to say.
Thank you. Sana or Sana, you can go next.
I can go. I think for me, I went in thinking, not knowing my power is something I think about a lot. Is like, I thought that I was, because of my age, because of my identity, because of like the lack of capital that I had $3K to my name. Like, I thought of myself as like the little guy, and I played into that for way too long instead of owning my power and owning what I was capable of doing. And I think that's a pretty classic, also very like femme thing to do, and kind of really being intentional about switching that and saying from day one, saying I am powerful, I have power, has been really helpful for me.
And Larissa.
Basically echoing everything Sana just said.
Okay. Stepping into your power.
Yeah, and if you don't, it results in you attracting people that you ultimately don't want to work with. And that could be on your board, or that could, not that I have anybody on my board that I don't want to work with. I'm just talking about general investors, right? It could be investors that come in, or it could be people on your team that later aren't a fit. Mm-hmm. And you're putting out your company and you're bringing in people that share in that vision. And if you're not putting out a strong, big vision and confidence or belief in yourself or belief in what you're doing, you're going to get people who look down on you.
Thank you. What a rich and inspiring conversation tonight. I want to thank our guests. Could everyone say thank you so we can hear you like we're in that big auditorium? Turn your mic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
So if I don't know if you three can stay around a few more minutes. Sometimes students just like to hang out for a few minutes afterward, but I just wanted to remind you, next week we're going to talk to Berkeley Food Systems change makers, some alumni, and then we're going to finish up the semester with Questlove on our final class meeting, which we're really excited about. And it's really time for you to get going on your papers now, and you'll notice that the paper, the homework assignments, the reflections, the research, the prompts that we've been giving you are all guiding you into bringing all